called the Big Conference, which was designed to bring together people from across the movement for basic income. And in this conference, we explored what would really be needed to respond to this current moment and build the momentum for basic income. And this summer, Income Movement has been holding a summer series to really deepen our understanding and commitment to this work. And so through that webinar series, we're exploring what's happening now, the role that cash can play, and how civil society, government, philanthropy, and community can come together to meet this moment. And we're extremely thrilled to be co-hosting this meeting with Give Directly and the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, really diving into what these federal funding changes following the one big, beautiful bill, as some call it, what that means for our community and how cash might be able to help respond to that moment. So today we'll go through a series of presentations from a number of experts. Joe Hughes will really talk about the impacts of the federal budget bill. Neva will talk about the state response and what's happening at a state level and actions that can be taken. And Pete will look at what is changing in the US landscape and really think about the role that cash can play. We'll then open it up to a panel discussion, including Stacy Rutland. And we'll open it up thereafter to the audience for a Q&A. Please, as I said before, put your questions into the Q&A. We'll answer some as they come, and then we'll save the rest of them for the Q&A portion. Once we get into the Q&A portion, you can always raise your hand and we can take you off mute to allow you to answer your question or ask your question out loud. We really want this to be an engaging and participatory webinar. If you have comments instead of questions, please also put those in the Q&A and I'll go ahead and read those out loud. But we're really thrilled to have everyone here and excited to explore these important topics. So to get us going, I want to hand it to Joe Hughes. Joe is a senior analyst at the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, where he focuses on federal tax policy, particularly on the impacts on low and middle income families. Prior to working at ITEP, Joe worked for the Congressional Research Service, focused on the federal child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. So with that, Joe, I will hand it to you to take us from here.
Thank you so much. And could probably go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to discuss broadly the policy changes over the last few months that affect low and middle income families and that also affect state budgets. So my focus is on federal tax policy. So I'm going to lean pretty heavily into the tax implications of the recent budget bill, but I will try to hit on a few other policy areas as well. So next slide, please, Jordan. So what are some of the major tax policies included in the budget mega bill? Well, really, the bill largely extends expiring provisions of the 2017 Trump tax law. When Republicans passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, they made the less popular business tax breaks permanent, and they made the tax cuts for individuals temporary. So that would cut down on the overall cost of the bill at that time. And basically, they were making a gamble that even if Democrats were in power in 2025, which we know that they aren't, most of the individual tax cuts would still be extended. Obviously, Democrats are not in power, but that is sort of what played out, is that all of these individual tax cuts were extended. And so this category of changes includes things like lower rates, a higher standard deduction, replacing dependent exemptions with a higher child tax credit. And these provisions have all been in effect with a few modifications for most of the past 8 years. So families are not really going to notice a change in their pocketbooks compared to what they were already scheduled to pay in 2025. And state budgets are not going to notice a difference from these things either, for the most part. But then there were other things that were included in this bill, other tax policy changes. Of course, Republicans are incapable of passing tax cuts for the middle class without also including giveaways for the rich. So the bill includes additional tax breaks for corporations and large businesses, also cuts to the estate tax. And then it includes a handful of so-called middle-class tax breaks. That's things like no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, a bigger deduction for seniors. And these are the things that the administration really wants to focus on. It's probably what they spend the most time talking about in the media. But they make up kind of a tiny percentage of all the tax cuts included in the bill. If you take the entire 10-year score of the bill, these things that they're spending all the time talking about are really about only 4% of the total cost of the bill. And so just to stay on the topic of these middle class tax breaks for a moment, it's important to remember how ineffective these policies are at helping low and middle income workers. They're very popular, but they're not very effective. Most workers are not employed in jobs where these tax cuts are even relevant. And for the people who are working in, say, tipped industries, many of them already make too little to owe federal income tax because these tax cuts do not apply to payroll taxes. They only apply to the individual income tax. So there are much better ways of helping low and middle income workers. Earned income tax credits, for example, are very well targeted, and they don't favor bartenders over nurses. So next slide, please, Jordan. So who wins and loses from this budget mega bill? Well, the top 20% receive more than 70% of the benefit. The bottom 40% receive just 4%. And then the top 1% alone receive more than 5 times as much as the bottom 40%. And I just threw out a bunch of numbers, a bunch of percentages. I'm not sure how well you can see the income changes or the income ranges on this chart here. But basically what that means is that the group of people making more than $900,000 annually, that group of people in aggregate get more than 5 times as much as everybody combined making less than $53,000. And like I mentioned to start, a lot of the benefits that are calculated here in this chart, particularly for the lower income groups, they're not actually different from what families are receiving in 2025. That's just extending provisions that were set to expire. So the modest amount that they are getting, it might not even be noticed. And then when we look at tariffs and some of the few tax increases in the bill, many low-income families will actually find that they are paying more in taxes relative to last year. So next slide, please, Jordan. So which tax policies are directly hurting low-income families? Well, the biggest tax change compared to current policy that's going to hurt lower income families are cuts to ACA premium tax credits. These are tax credits that reduce the premiums that families pay on the ACA marketplace. They were enhanced in 2021 and 2022, but the enhanced credits expire after 2025. And Republicans decided to let these things go ahead and expire. So when we look on a current policy basis, many families are actually going to feel their income shrink from the combination of the tax policies in this bill and the expiration of enhanced premium tax credits. So in this chart here to the left, you can see net changes in income due to all of these policy changes combined. Yellow means that they have a net tax increase, and blue means a net tax cut. And so what you see here is that the bottom 40% are actually made slightly worse off by the combination of the tax policies in this mega bill plus the expiration of ACA credits. And when we broke this out in our analysis by state, the chart here is at the national level. We broke it out by state, and we found that there were actually only 3 states where the lowest income groups are better off. And that's New York, Minnesota, and DC. It's all states, well, states plus DC, states with with robust Medicaid programs where there are fewer low-income individuals relying on marketplace coverage. Next slide, please.
And Joe, there's just one clarification question coming through the Q&A.
Yeah.
Given what you said, the middle class tax breaks are either deductions or non-refundable tax credits. Is that correct?
Yes, for the most part, the child tax credit, which I'll get to later, is a refundable credit. The refundable portion is well, the entire credit itself is increased by a very modest amount. So, of course, we have to discuss the impacts of tariffs. In this chart, the yellow shows the increase in taxes from tariffs, and the blue shows the tax cuts included in the budget bill. And what you can see here is that fully 80% of Americans come out essentially even or worse off. And it's worse for the lower income groups. The poorest 20%, households making less than $27,000, they see a net tax increase of about 2% when tariffs are factored in. I didn't know what really to say about tariffs. The administration's tariff policy sort of changes day to day, hour to hour, but it did go into effect today. There is now some range of tariffs up to 50% almost across the board. The average effective tax rate, I believe, is about 17% on all imported goods. So naturally, this means that prices for almost everything are going to rise. Groceries are going to be more expensive because we don't grow bananas or coffee or so many other things in the United States. Clothes and shoes are going to be more expensive. Cars, phones, computers, things that are necessities for many workers and families, they're all going to be more expensive. So I like to think of this chart as showing how tariffs eat into the value of whatever tax breaks families are getting from this budget mega bill. Next slide, please. Right, so back to the CTC, which I just mentioned earlier. Before I move on from the tax area, I know this is what a lot of people on this call are interested in. The bill does include a very modest increase in the CTC. It raises the maximum credit amount from $2,000 to $2,200, but it doesn't do anything to make the credit more accessible for low-income families where the credits are reduced, right? So it doesn't do anything to expand refundability. And in that way, this bill is actually, this expansion is actually way more paltry than the credit reforms that the House Republicans voted for just last year in a bipartisan tax package that never cleared the Senate. And another thing that I'd like to note here is that if you look at the credit amount of $2,200 compared to a $2,000 credit that was enacted in 2017, first went into effect in 2018, this is actually a drop in real terms in purchasing power due to the COVID era inflation than what families were getting in 2018. And then, of course, we have to mention that the bill kicks potentially millions of kids off of the CTC who are living in immigrant households. These are children who themselves have Social Security numbers. The tax code already required the children to have Social Security numbers. So the children who are being kicked off of the CTC are mostly citizen children. And I don't like to use the term supposed to be here, like where do they belong? But I think it's very important in this case to note that these are children who are legally supposed to be here in the United States. This is where the tax code and where our legal system says they are supposed to be. And those are the children who are getting kicked off of the CTC just to punish their parents. Next slide, please. So Medicaid and SNAP. I am not an expert on Medicaid or SNAP policy, I'm sure that there are a lot of people on this call who know a lot more than I do, but it would be almost impossible to talk about how this bill affects low-income families and also how it affects state budgets without discussing the changes to Medicaid and SNAP. So the cuts to Medicaid are pretty dramatic. They're really dramatic. It cuts more than $1 trillion from Medicaid and CHIP over the next 10 years. And the latest CBO estimate that I was able to find shows that 10.5 million people will lose coverage over the next 10 years. Some people lose because of direct eligibility restrictions. Other people lose coverage just simply due to onerous paperwork requirements. They are people who are otherwise eligible for Medicaid, but will lose just due to the paperwork requirements. And then the bill also restricts the mechanisms through which states can raise revenue to fund their Medicaid programs. So states are kind of getting hit in two directions. On the one hand, there are fewer people who are eligible for Medicaid. And then on the other hand, the states themselves are being restricted in the ways that they can fund Medicaid. And we know that when low income families lose Medicaid coverage, that doesn't mean that they go buy a private plan instead. Mostly what that means is they're just not going to be covered, right? And that puts hospitals at risk, particularly hospitals in the rural areas of red states. But of course, any hospital that has a high percentage of Medicaid patients will also be at risk. And then finally, SNAP. The bill shifts much of the cost burden of SNAP to states and municipalities, and they kind of do that in two ways. One, the bill requires states to cover a higher percentage of administrative costs than they do currently. And then second, for states with higher error rates in SNAP, meaning the federal government thinks they're giving SNAP benefits to people who they shouldn't, the bill shifts some of the cost burden of the actual SNAP benefits themselves to states. And next slide, please. Yeah, so staying on the subject of state budgets, I talked a lot about how the tax provisions affect families, but I didn't mention how they affect states. Most states conform to federal definition of certain tax calculations for their state income tax calculations. So when there's a change at the federal level, that change automatically trickles down to states. So if the federal government, for example, includes a new exclusion in the calculation of a household's income, then many states are going to automatically include that new exclusion as well. And to be clear about this, what I'm saying is not that states are changing their laws to match the federal government, but the opposite. It happens automatically. And if they do not want to match the federal government, then they have to have special sessions to change their own state tax code. And right here, I've included a brief list of provisions in the budget bill that could lead to lower tax collections at the state level if states don't move away from the federal tax code. But that list right there is, I think, hardly exhaustive. So if you would like to know about your own state, please reach out to me or Neva, and I'm sure contact info will be shared. But suffice it to say that states don't need to sit around and wait to find out if their revenue is dropping from conformity issues. Time to fix those things is right now before we go into the tax season next year and see that revenues are dropping. Next slide, please. So the timeline. When do these things go into effect, and when are families and states going to feel the impact? Most of the provisions on the tax side go into effect immediately, meaning that low-income families and state revenue agencies are going to see the impacts next year, really as early as February when the first tax refunds go out. But again, for most families, the changes on the tax side are going to be pretty modest or non-existent compared to what they were already expected to receive in 2025. And then the changes to Medicaid and SNAP, generally those are not going to go into effect until 2027 or 2028 because Republicans wanted to get past the 2026 midterms before families and state and local governments were going to feel the sting from those changes. And then the tax exemptions for tips, overtime, auto loan interest, the senior deduction, those all expire after 2028. And I didn't include tariffs on this slide because it was unclear a few days ago or even like yesterday whether the current tariff policy would actually go into effect. And they still might be rescinded at any time. But as of today, these broad tariffs up to 50% are now in effect. And so states, again, they can't wait for the impacts to be felt before states act. Markets have reacted pretty wildly to Trump's make it up as he goes along economic policy. So there's no telling what's around the corner. States need to act now, shore up their revenues. And then I believe there's just one slide left. Yep. So my contact info is there. That's pretty much it for me. I just wanted to leave us off with the bottom line here, which is that this budget bill is a major shift of resources away from states, away from low income families, and into tax breaks for the top 1%. And so that is it for me, and I will hand it back over to Jordan.
Thanks so much, Joe. And we will share these slides out with everyone, so you'll have Joe and the rest of the team's contact information if you need it. We've seen a lot of activity in the Q&A just talking about the impact that these cuts are having on the lowest income individuals and even folks on this call who have been impacted by losing Medicaid due to just paperwork issues. So I think what Joe spoke about and the real impacts of these are being felt by individuals even before these policies passed, but now that they passed, I think they'll continue to have an impact on so many. With that, I think it's important to dive now into kind of what states are doing and what these federal implications mean at a state level. So Neva Butkus is a senior analyst on the state policy team at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. In addition to supporting state level advocates in their fights for equitable and adequate tax systems, she leads ITEP's state level child tax credit work. Prior to ITEP, she was the senior analyst at the Louisiana Budget Project, which is now known as Invest in Louisiana, where she led the state's first child tax credit campaign. She lives and works in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And with that, I will hand it to you, Neva.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Hi, everyone. I see lots of familiar faces in the participants list. So thank you all for being here and happy to talk to you, or maybe not happy, but I'm here and I'm here to talk to you about the state response and action that we're seeing around the federal bill and where cash is going to play a role and what we can all do about it. So with that, Jordan, feel free to go to the first slide. So before we know where we're going, we need to figure out where we've been. So I wanted to start off with some information on recent state tax trends that we've seen. So in the wake of the pandemic, states were flush with cash, thanks to a variety of factors, including, federal aid coming down the pipeline, the economy kind of bouncing back quicker than people had anticipated, UI benefits, states decreased their forecasts, thinking that there might be a recession. And then when revenues were above projected, it looked like there was a surplus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, this similarly happened in 2008, and so the response was similar as well. Some states took it as an opportunity to make investments during a really tumultuous and unpredictable economic time period, and then other states used it as an excuse to cut taxes and said, hey, we have all this money. We obviously are taxing people way, way too much. Let's just give it back. What could go wrong? So 10 states cut personal income taxes in 2025 alone. 2 of those states, Mississippi and Oklahoma, have actually taken steps to fully eliminate their personal income tax in the next like 5 to 10 years, and basically phase it out. This is compounding on years of deep personal income tax cuts. From 2021 to 2023, 26 states cut personal and or corporate income tax rates. And the fallout from this, as we tried to tell lawmakers at ITEP, is that, you know, these revenues are not, or these surplus revenues are not permanent. They're not recurring. They are going to dry up as we get further and further away from the pandemic and, or, you know, from 2020 and the federal aid that came alongside that time. And we're starting, I think, to see the cracks in some of these states. So for instance, Iowa, which cut income taxes more than almost any other state in the nation in the past few years, they're using $900 million in reserves for their budget this year. Nebraska is currently, for a couple years now, has been trying to fill this impending shortfall of $432 million. Louisiana, where I live, is anticipating a shortfall by 2027, and North Carolina revenues are anticipated to be falling flat as of now, and a deficit is anticipated by 2027 as well in that state. Feel free to go to the next slide. Thank you. Some states have, with the federal bill and the anticipation of the federal bill and the implications of that this past legislative session, some states preserved and raised revenue knowing what was coming down the pipeline. Illinois, for instance, raised taxes on tobacco products and then increased taxes on large global corporations through a GILTI tax. Maryland created 2 new brackets, one on earners making over $500,000 a year and another one on earners making over $1 million a year, and started taxing capital gains more. They had some consumption tax changes as well on cannabis and sports betting and digital services. Washington State made some changes to their capital gains tax and their estate tax, and then also increased consumption taxes to kind of shore up revenue and prepare their budget. And yeah, we're seeing states across the country, regardless of political party and power, consider special sessions at the moment. Close to 24 states at this point have either confirmed or proposed special sessions and cited implications from the federal bill as a reason specifically, because they know that their budget's going to be in trouble. I will say that this, while preserving revenue has not necessarily, raising revenue hasn't necessarily been an across the board thing we're seeing, there are states that are redder that are still preserving revenue. In Louisiana this year, the Senate killed 2 very deep tax cut bills, and they cited that they were lawmakers that had been around in 2008. They saw the signs, and they're not interested in having to make the same decisions with their budget that they had to during the Great Recession. And so they cut 2 bills out of Senate Revenue and Fiscal Committee and said, no, we're keeping that revenue. Next slide, please. The role cash can play in this right now. So obviously we're at an interesting point in time. Families across the country, to say they've been like feeling the pinch feels like such a drastic understatement. I'm sure many people on this call work with families and households that are low income or of a working class, you know, socioeconomic status, and we know what their reality is, and it's not good. And things are potentially going, or not even potential, things are going to get worse for a lot of people. And while child tax credits can't fill the gap of Medicaid, the role of cash can play an important part in what's coming down the pipeline, and I think bring people together around some good policy. So in 2021, the federal CTC expansion cut child poverty in half, like basically overnight. A big part of this was the boost in the credit amount, but also the fact that it was made fully refundable for low-income families. Right now, if you make under around $30,000 a year, you can't claim the full CTC. Only like a percentage of it is technically refundable to you. And yeah, states saw this impact after the credit expansion lapsed when we hit 2022. And many states decided to build on it by creating and administering their own tax credits. Pre 2020 and 2021, very few states had child tax credits on the books. The ones that existed were very small. They were refundable or some of them non-refundable, some of them were refundable-ish, like New York's. And yeah, it just was not that popular of a policy. Today, they're becoming increasingly popular and bipartisan. 15 states now have child tax credits on the books. Georgia passed one this year. It's non-refundable, but it was carried across the finish line in a very bipartisan fashion. And we're also seeing states really develop and conceptualize these credits with an eye on child poverty reduction as the goal. We know this because credits are bigger than ever. Many states now have maximum credits of over $1,000 per child. And states like Minnesota are even now authorizing advanced payments where families can receive some of their CTC month to month to help with everyday expenses. Other states, I believe Colorado and Vermont, if I'm not mistaken, authorized advanced payments in their legislation as an option. It just has been flushed out by their administration or revenue departments. But hopefully down the line, that's something we start seeing pick up steam in other states. Next slide, please. So this is just a map to show you where CTCs live right now, and when states enacted them. Georgia is not on this map because theirs does not go into effect for 2020 until 2026. And some of you might be aware that DC also had one that was supposed to go into effect in 2026, and it looks like it's going to be cut from their budget and unfunded. So yeah, I'm not putting all my eggs in a basket until the credit goes into effect and it's actually time. So yeah, feel free. Next slide. Thank you. So not all CTCs are created equal, especially if the goal here is to reduce poverty in families with children and help families get what they need and make sure that we're getting the biggest bang for our buck in terms of who we're helping and who needs it the most. So the most impactful child tax credits at the state level, or really, any level, they must be refundable. They should not be coupled to the federal credit because the federal credit has a lot of imperfections, including the kind of on-ramp to the maximum amount for really low-income families. It needs to be a meaningful amount per child and targeted to the families who need it most. So that could be, really front-loading the credit for really low-income households, boosting the credit for really young children where we know the extra cash goes a long way. Because young children are expensive and their developmental years are so important. Ideally, these credits would be available for households filing with ITINs or Social Security numbers, and ideally also no earnings requirement, because we know that many low-income families are in and out of work for a variety of reasons, whether it's because they work seasonally or because they can't afford to put their grandmother in any facility, and so they're a primary caregiver in addition to raising children, and that doesn't show up necessarily on their taxes, but we know they exist and they deserve every dollar they can get to make ends meet. Next slide, please.
Neva, can you just explain a bit more about what you mean by refundable?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great question for whoever asked it, because I live in tax policy world. And yeah, so if let's say you owe your tax liability in your state is $300 at the end of the year when you need to pay your taxes. And if your state has $1,000 per child refundable tax credit, that means you are going to get $700 back if you have one kid. It's going to absolve you of that $300, and then it's going to refund you everything extra. Non-refundable credits will only bring you down to $0. And then when you start stacking non-refundable credits on top of other credits like earned income tax credits or other things, families get to zero really, really fast. And the lowest income families who may not pay a ton in state income taxes, but they sure pay a lot in sales taxes and property taxes, right? Because people like to pretend like income taxes are the only taxes that matter, even though most states are very much relying on sales taxes to fund services, which disproportionately ask more of low-income families. Yeah, non-refundable tax credits will only bring you down to zero. So you don't benefit from the full amount if you don't pay much in taxes typically. Yeah. So there are obviously obstacles to cash assistance, whether we're talking about child tax credits, UBI programs, or anything in between. There's a narrative that cash isn't helpful. I'm sure many of us have seen the Dailies episode from yesterday or read the corresponding New York Times piece. Yes, see how those kinds of talking points might kind of seep into our work about how cash doesn't actually assist families, or which goes against, everything we know about anything about living. But here we are. And states are also banning universal basic income programs. Arkansas, Idaho, Iowa, Kansas, and South Dakota are the states that have already banned these programs within their state. There are other states that have been discussing this as well. And there's also just a general political will issue to tax the top to fund really meaningful credits. A really meaningful child tax credit is not cheap. Minnesota's, which I think is one of the most robust in the country, when they enacted it, it's going to cost the state about $400 million a year, which is not nothing for a state with 5-6 million people in it. It's a lot of money. And to fund these kinds of programs, we're not going to find $500 million just like randomly sitting in a state budget. Oftentimes, revenue raisers need to be paired with these credits to make tax codes less regressive, but also to fund them and keep them stable and reduce income inequality. There tends to be a lot more political desire to create these credits for children than to tax the top 1% to do it. So that's an obstacle. Yeah, just getting people in the revenue conversation and really showing people that we're not going to be able to change much if we are not willing to ask corporations and the wealthiest in our state to pay their fair share, so that everybody has what they need to just simply survive. So. And I think that might be my last slide. Yep, there's my contact info if anyone needs it. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Just want to acknowledge there's some great questions in the Q&A. We are not ignoring them, but they require a little meatier answers. So when we get to the Q&A portion, we'll start to answer those. And thanks for people who are sharing their own experience in the Q&A. It's really important to contextualize this macro, big picture view of what's happening day to day in the lives of all of us in our community. So appreciate that. So with that, I want to hand it to our last presenter before we get into a panel discussion. Pete Subkowiak is a leader at the intersection of direct cash and economic mobility. During the Biden administration, he led the Resilient Families Hub, which was a policy initiative focused on getting more money into the hands of lower and working class families. Prior to his federal service, he was the Director of Guaranteed Income and Economic Mobility at the Cook County Bureau of Economic Development. There, he led the nation's largest publicly funded guaranteed income pilot, and he's now serving as a senior advisor at GiveDirectly. So with that, I will hand it to you, Pete.
Thanks, Jordan. Hi, everybody. It's so great to see so many people here today, and my thanks to Jordan and Stacy at Income Movement and Neva and Joe at ITAP for joining us at GiveDirectly to put on this webinar. I am going to walk you through some work that I did earlier this year in the spring, putting together a rapid response memo that kind of assessed some of the major economic shifts that were happening at the federal policy level and try to understand what that meant for low-income people and how cash might be able to help. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. But to start out, to just give you a quick introduction into GiveDirectly, if you don't know about us, GiveDirectly has been around since 2008. It's one of the oldest organizations that's completely dedicated to unconditional cash. We've done over 900 million in cash transfers to just under 2 million people globally. Started in Africa and have expanded our work since there. You can go to the next slide. The US team, the US program, has been around since 2017 and really got underway in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. And I sit on the US team, and we help design, administer, fundraise, and collaborate on research. On many programs, we have 15 right now. And have done work and provided cash transfers to people in 51 states and territories. You can see there that we partner with nonprofit organizations. We've partnered with cities, counties, and states to do our work. So we do a lot around public-private partnerships for cash transfers. Next slide. Okay, and so this is the paper that I was mentioning that I did a couple months ago, called a rapid response memo. You can scan the QR code there and get access to it. It's also available on GiveDirectly's website, givedirectly.org/policy and advocacy. And just to flag for you, this was completed in early May, and obviously policy at the federal level is changing by the day. So some of the numbers in the rapid response memo might not be so up to date, but it does give you sort of an overall big picture view of the sweeping changes and what the impacts could be or likely will be to states, to safety nets, and to low-income people. So I did this so that we could assess on these different levels what the impacts would be on states who manage safety net programs, what the changes to safety net programs themselves would be, and then ultimately how those things and the other major federal economic changes are going to filter down to the lives of low and moderate income people, and then to understand and to share this information with the broader cash community to come together and discuss, well, what does this mean for how cash programs might be able to help at such a moment of crisis for so many people. Next slide. So there are four major areas that the rapid response memo drilled in on: deportation policy, tariffs, DOGE, and then the new tax law. And I'll talk a little bit about each of them. And by the way, these numbers on the slides are up to date. So these are current numbers. The memo itself on the website has a little bit older information. So obviously, one of the major things that President Trump was dedicated to doing was mass deportation. And obviously, this has a significant effect on the lives and the cultural lives and the makeup of our country, but also looking at it at an economic through an economic frame. There's also significant impacts here. Not only do immigrants disproportionately make up many workforce sectors like our food, farming, agriculture sector, and construction, but when you remove this many people, he would like to remove up to 11 million people in the country. You are taking away so many people who are working, who are paying taxes, and who are supporting their families. So some of the major impacts here are you could see up to 10 million people from mixed status families being pushed into poverty. And then broader impacts in terms of macroeconomic impacts would include higher prices, especially on food and construction. We know how much we need new affordable housing. That's going to get more expensive to create. And reduced economic growth, because if you have fewer people working in a country, demand reduces, supply becomes harder to create, and so it tends to reduce overall economic growth. Next slide. The tariffs. As Joe said, the tariff policy seems to change by the moment, and it's very hard to follow. One resource that I'd like to mention to folks here who are interested in being able to understand I think they are definitely looking at tariffs, but I think they're also keeping track of the new tax law. The Budget Lab at Yale University has they consistently are updating their analysis based on the new and ever-changing tariff decisions to understand what this actually means for consumer prices, and how much more people are going to be paying for stuff due to the tariff policy. And so at this point, right now, their estimate is that for low-income families, they are going to pay $1,300 more per year in added costs due to the tariffs. And a lot of essential items like food and energy and clothing are disproportionately impacted in terms of these price increases. Another thing that could definitely happen is the tariffs could slow down the economy. Market volatility tends to lead businesses to pause what they're doing, to not invest, not hire, because they're unsure of where the market is going. And so they kind of hunker down versus going ahead in terms of investing and hiring more people, putting out more products into the world. So this increases the likelihood that a recession follows these tariffs. And we're seeing with jobs reports, jobs slow down in terms of job creation. And that may very well be leading us into recession territory. Next, Doge. So Doge, especially at the beginning of the year, was highly active and has so far fired or done away with around 260,000 federal workers. And what this actually means in terms of economic impact and impact on low-income people is weaker federal government services. And so one of the big things that's been in the news, for instance, is Social Security and how Social Security offices are closing. There were phone line assistance helplines that are being defunded. And so it makes it harder for both people to get help in terms of their federal services and benefits that they're entitled to. But the other thing that it does is it has a ripple effect down to the state and local level, because a lot of what the state and local governments have to do to continue to do their work, they need help and assistance or communication and guidance, at least, from the federal government to do their work. Well, a lot of the people who provided the guidance and communicated and coordinated with states have been fired. And so a lot of that work is not happening, which means it's gumming up work at the state and federal government levels as well. Other things to note here in terms of Doge is the rescinding of grants and the cutting of grants for nonprofits and research institutions, which definitely in the long run will impact our competitiveness as a country and our economy. And finally, the tax law. I won't talk too much about this because Joe and Neva gave a great overview. But the tax law is going to cut significantly into things like Medicaid and SNAP food assistance. The ACA credits are probably not getting talked enough about in the media, but I think those are going to be significant for low and moderate income people as well. And then on top of all this, it also adds a significant amount to the national debt, which is not great for our long-term sustainability. All right, so at the end of the day, what we're very interested in here is what does this actually mean? Low-income people, and I've got a few takeaways here, which is the tariff price increases and the changes in the tax law, the negative changes are actually going to outweigh any tax cut for the bottom 80% of earners. So, and as Joe relayed, lower income people are much worse off. Higher costs for essential goods due to tariffs, supply increases, supply issues, I should say. Loss of income for mixed status families, and reduced access to safety net programs are the big themes here. And so how could cash programs help respond? I think we're going to focus a lot about this on the panel and in our Q&A. So I just gave one example here, the next slide, that to me, the food issue, access to food, is a really big one that we should be thinking about because 3 of the 4 things that I just reviewed, deportations, tariffs, and the tax law, are all going to negatively impact access to food and affordable food. So looking at how a cash program might work with state SNAP programs and food pantries and whatnot to help ensure that people are not going hungry is one obvious place that I think that we should be looking to work. And with that, I thank you. You have my contact information there, and I will hand it back to Jordan.
Thanks so much, Pete. If everybody wants to come on video now, we're going to move into a panel discussion with a few questions. Pete, Neva, and Joe will be on the panel, but there's one more face you're seeing pop up, and that is Stacy Rutland, who is the Executive Director of Income Movement. She'll also be joining that panel. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can see everybody's lovely faces. So thank you all for that presentation and that context. I think it was a lot to take in, and it was really important information about what the impact of these federal cuts are. I think that I'm just pulling up my questions, my screen switch, so bear with me here. But there are some really important takeaways here from a timeline perspective. You all talked a lot about how these provisions may not take effect until 2027, 2028. So maybe Neva, starting with you, you mentioned that some states have preserved or even raised revenue during this last legislative session. Can you talk us through how some of these wins were accomplished, and if you think there's opportunities to do similar work in other places? And everyone else, feel free to hop in after.
Yeah, great question. So I think we have kind of like 2 different types of adversaries when it comes to this at the state level, and we need to be able to identify who is who. So you have this whole group of lawmakers that are like okay with just cutting taxes, and there's I think a group of them that are really bought into this idea that lower taxes is good for business. Things that are good for business will mean higher paying jobs and more investment and so on and so forth and whatever. And then I think you have another group of adversaries that know that cutting taxes will dismantle government in the name of privatization, ceasing democracy to exist as we know it. Like this, that I think there are two different groups of lawmakers that, and so I think the second group is a lost cause. Like, we're not going to change any of their minds whatsoever. But the first group, I think we have a lot of commonalities with. They are lawmakers that, while they believe in like business and investment, like they also do have, I think, an interest in seeing lower income folks do better. And they want to take credit for that. They have a bootstrap mentality that we all know is completely crap, but I do think they have some semblance of like good intentions behind them. And I think that's what we saw here in Louisiana when our senators killed these bad tax bills. So it's really, I think, layering on, reminding them that we've been here before. And by we, I mean advocates, right? Like, these advocates we all should be screaming at the top of our lungs in these state houses that, and just beating the drum that, that we have to preserve this revenue, or we're going to see what we saw in 2008 or potentially worse. Reminding lawmakers too that most states haven't bounced back even from what we saw in 2008. Like, there was a recession, states were flush with cash, they cut a bunch of taxes, the chips fell where they landed, and in many states, university tuitions went up, private or public school tuitions went up, and that hasn't recovered since then. Their, child and family services budgets were cut to the bone, and we're seeing lawsuit after lawsuit about cases falling through the cracks and children being harmed. Like, all of these things are connected. So really, really painting the picture for them and painting taxes and revenue in the budget as like really the core part of all of this, because lawmakers do have a short memory, and there's been a lot of turnover in recent years as states have enacted term limits. And I think we just need to be really, really clear and be just a constant earworm for these lawmakers and for people, because people also don't draw the connections as well. And if people are aware and citizens are aware, we can hold more lawmakers accountable on this front. So.
Anything anyone else would want to add to that? Okay. Building on that, thinking, and maybe Joe, you're the best person to start us off with this, is just what are some meaningful things we can do on the tax front to improve access and size of credits specifically that people can receive in the coming years?
Yeah, no, I think definitely people need to keep pushing at the state level to expand child tax credits and earned income credits. I started working on this issue in 2017 at the federal level, but I've followed the state progress since then. And as Neva pointed out in her presentation, we've seen so many states adopt and expand their refundable credits in the last 10 or so years. At the federal level, I don't think it's impossible that this Congress could revisit the child tax credit. I do think it's probably unlikely, but I don't think it's impossible. I mean, like I mentioned in my presentation, House Republicans voted for a much larger enhancement of the credit just last year than what they passed in this budget bill. That bill would have made the credit phase in per child instead of per family. So that would mean that lower income families with more than one child would be eligible for a larger credit amount. And across the board at the federal and state level, we've seen a lot of interest in the child tax credit in particular, not just from progressives, but also from conservatives taking the pro-family angle. So, I think just keep pushing on this, keep sharing the message of how many children are currently left out. And I'm very pessimistic on a lot of things politically. It's one thing that I'm sort of optimistic about is that I do think we're in a slow march towards a much better income support for children and families at both the federal and state levels.
Thanks, Joe. We need a little optimism after these three presentations, so appreciate that. Anyone else want to add anything there?
I'll just say that in terms of child tax credits, Minnesota really has an outstanding child tax credit that they just implemented. I think it passed in 2023 and it's fully online this year. And it allows people to, like the temporary child tax credit at the federal level back in 2021, it allows families to opt in to receive monthly payments up front of that child tax credit. It's a very interesting case, and just kind of gives us some hope that at the state level, there is a path being built to build more effective and flexible CTC and cash policy.
Thanks, Pete. And I think Colorado is another state that built in a provision to a different credit, the family affordability tax credit, that can be, although it's not currently being implemented monthly. And there was some chatter in the chat as well about Oregon and some work they've done in that space. But Stacy, why don't you come in here?
Well, I was just going to say that I think that there's some things that we can, I know most of the people that are here today have come into this session through the lens of basic income or guaranteed income, and really thinking about how do we ultimately support our community members that are going to be most directly feeling the impact of everything that we just, the kind of bad news that we knew, but now have just been solidified based on all the conversations here today. And I think that really any work that we are going to do to help build any kind of direct response where more cash is going into the pockets of community members is to really think about how we can connect the work that we have been doing in the movement around basic income and all the data that's coming out, connect that to some of the opportunities that we think that our legislators should take advantage of when it comes to responding. So there's been a lot of conversation here around tax credits, and we all know the connection of tax credits to direct cash and guaranteed income. But I think that, at the big conference this year, researchers came together and started to ask themselves the questions around, like, how do we start to make the data from all of this work that we've been doing in this community serve the movement, and really, start to take a little bit more of like the practical approach of research and data as we try to come up with a meaningful response. And so really thinking about together, how do we look at the data around impacts on food scarcity and overall health and well-being of families, and and reducing hunger rates of children, and all of those different pieces, connecting that to tax credits results that we have seen both in the states that have passed things as well as the 2021 CTC at the federal level. Connecting the dots for our electeds is going to be a really important part of this, and then also giving opportunities to our community members who are most impacted by this, giving them the support and resources for them to start showing up and screaming at the top of their lungs at every opportunity where there's a budget conversation happening with electeds, whether at the state, city, or county level. So I think there's some really important things that we can be doing, and it's a big part of what happened at the big conference this year. Like, how do we actually do this work, and what we know we want to continue to dig into over this kind of summer series is actually rolling up our sleeves and getting into some brass tacks about how to coordinate and have a meaningful response. And today's really setting the stage for that. But I just wanted to help kind of connect, because I know a lot of folks are trying to figure out how to, as quickly as possible, get money into the pockets of people. And tax credits sometimes take a while to actually get passed, and not only to get passed, but then also to end up being instated so that the money actually hits pockets. So there's a lot that I think can be thinking about and doing to connect all these dots and potentially start to think about a short-term opportunities that I know Pete is a big part of what Pete's white paper was about, kind of starting to help us think about opportunities in front of us.
Yeah, thanks. Building on that, Pete, do you want to just come in and really beyond tax credits? Do you see there's things that we could lean into now that can cover these gaps? As Stacy mentioned, it might take a couple of years for these. Like, what are some big swings, some big ideas we could lean into now?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of just broad responses to that. The first of which is I think that there is space to build a really smart and strategic response to the snap cuts, especially because they don't come online for a little bit. So I think that there is a great opportunity to work with state governments and then food advocates to carve something out in that lane. I also think that there potentially could be ways to look at the TANF funding that states have. Depending on the state, they do more or less cash assistance. Some states have, in years past had issues where they're spending it on things that it's really hard to make a case that they're actually making an impact. There's also been some scandals around contractors using the money inappropriately. And there's also some policies within TANF that allow you to use direct cash assistance for a short duration and target it to people, and they don't necessarily have to be on the TANF program. They do have to be, of a certain income level. So I think that there are creative ways to use TANF, and also see if state assemblies are open to sort of interrogating some of the money there and that may not really be being spent effectively. So those are two areas that I think that advocates could look into, but I'm very interested to hear our Q&A and discussion moving forward to brainstorm more beyond that.
Thanks.
Well,
Anyone else want to add anything on just some big swings we can take now? Stacy, go ahead.
Well, I think the big swings is important. I also think that sometimes we get so lost in the big swings that it feels a little unattainable. And so how do we actually think about big swings and the small things that we can all be doing to help prepare for those big swings? And so like even, some of what Pete was just speaking to, which is, awesome, really thinking about how do we partner with folks in the food kind of the food sovereignty and food like support spaces, right? That there's a lot of experts, but there's also a lot of really important small local efforts that are connected into kind of communities that are thinking statewide and even at the national level. And I know, just looking at the list, we have the privilege of seeing the list of names and the attendees. There's right now dozens and dozens of community members, people who are pilot participants or community activists that are on this call right now. And I think sometimes it can feel really hard to be like, I'm supposed to start advocating for TANF dollars. What am I doing? But I do think that right now there's kind of two things that are happening, two intentional things that the Big Bad Bill is trying to create. One is a sense of hopelessness and a sense of kind of chaos and a forcing of folks to go to be in survival mode even more than they already were. There's also a desire, I think, to by doing that, isolate people. And I think, some of the things when we think about like housing and food, some of the things that we all can, whether we're working in an organization or we're a volunteer or whatever our role is here, we're all passionate about this, but there's so much mutual aid work. There's community gardens. There's like really important areas where people are coming together that can nurture the one, and I think one of the most important pieces from a psychological level is to connect to our community and to actually feel that we're not alone, to feel like there's opportunities here, and that through some of those avenues, we can be connected to folks, nonprofits, organizations who are hooked into some of those broader, efforts that might be happening at the county or state level or even the federal level. So I think that there's this kind of many pronged approaches that we could be taking, and the things that we need most to be able to sustain ourselves through this, because it's going to be a long haul and it's going to be a very painful, we're in a very long marathon right now, not a sprint. So how do we support each other and keep our energy going as we move forward through this? And I think that community piece can be really vital.
Thanks, Stacy. We have some amazing Q&A questions. I'm going to start pulling those up because I want to make sure we have time to at least tackle some of them. So one of the first questions from Cecile is just, how do you navigate the need for a state child tax credit to help families that are struggling versus this need for states to preserve their revenue to maintain their budget in light of these federal cuts? I don't know who wants to tackle that one.
I got that one.
I thought so.
Yeah, no, this is like something we think about every day on the state team for sure. Right, we have a finite amount of resources and a finite amount of time at state legislators or state legislative sessions, so it's truly a balancing act. I would say this year, as state surpluses have dried up, one of the things we did pivot to while talking to a lot of our state partners was talking a little bit less about trying to go after like a Minnesota style CTC, which is this year or next year, I think going to be $1,800 per child. And really focus like priority number one as preserving revenue and making sure that your state budget is stable and you have what you need, or at least as close as we can get to weathering the storm that is going to be these SNAP and Medicaid cuts as they start impacting state budgets. So that's one of the reasons we really are urging state partners that if they're going to go after like a really meaningful child tax credit, it needs to be paired with a revenue raiser. There needs similar to Maryland, I mentioned their new brackets this year. They use some of that money to just shore up revenues, but also they use some of that money to create a phase out for their child tax credit. It was like a hard cutoff at $15,000 a year. It was really, really small, and very few families received their CTC, only families with very, very low incomes. Now they have like a little tail phase out that they helped fund, so families can get a portion of it up to, I think, $24,000 a year. Still really small, and not many families are impacted comparatively, but they used money in taxing the top 1% to fund that. So that's what we would recommend if you're going to go after CTCs, to get in the revenue conversation as well, especially at this time. And yeah, really bolster up that revenue, making your tax system less equitable or more equitable. That's something that ITEP, that's our whole shtick basically, is helping partners and organizers and advocates on the state level understand their tax system better and understand who is actually paying into it and where the discrepancies are in fairness, and then enacting policies to go after things that can make the tax system more fair, whether that is CTCs at the bottom end of the spectrum or taxing the top 1% or top 5% or what have you on the opposite end of the spectrum. So
thanks. I think there's another question in the chat that really builds upon that is, are there creative revenue sources that states are coming up with to fund things like CTCs? And how are states thinking about ensuring those aren't regressive and that they're kind of harming the same people they're intended to benefit? Any thoughts from folks on that?
Well, we know at the big conference, this was something that came up, and there's definitely some exploration around some creative ways to think about generating new taxes or new revenues off of, on expanding or new areas. There's some of the folks in Illinois are looking at marijuana and marijuana taxes and what it means to like funding broader direct cash programs is something that is being explored. I know in Colorado, there's some initial conversations and polling that's likely to be released soon around a range of different possible new revenue streams, including some of the AI and kind of data. And are there, ways, if we think about what our next stage of our economy looks like, are there opportunities for, in particular, where we know that there might be certain sectors or certain companies that are going to significantly benefit from a lot of these new pieces of technology. How do we make sure that all of those profits, there's a certain percentage that's going back to folks, especially if it leads to job loss or kind of shifts in what professions are out there. And I know, our next summer series session is going to dig deeper into the impacts of AI. This was something that kind of came up, but I think it is an important piece here, because some of what we're talking about is in 2027, 2028, when a lot of these things go into effect, the cuts on Medicaid and SNAP, we might actually have, so we're losing a bunch of people are going to lose access, but we might also have a much larger increased number of people who need those resources once those kick in, because they've lost their jobs, or kind of a range of things that we know are going to be the impacts here. So not only are some people going to lose it, but there's going to be a larger group of people who need it who are not going to be able to have access. And so it's a pretty, the urgency is now for sure. And I love that, some folks in the questions and have been asking, like, can we do things, like, let's figure out how to do things now to try to get ahead of what we know is coming down the pipeline, so that we're as much as possible protecting folks when those things do hit.
Any other thoughts from folks on revenue sources?
Yeah, at the state level, I would say that, while it's not necessarily creative, the real money is just large corporations and the ultra wealthy. And I mean wealthy as in wealth, not as an income, So I think that, and not even I think, right? Polling shows that taxing the top 1% and taxing large multinational corporations is very popular. People like it, lawmakers don't, because that's who gives them money. So that's who we need to go after. Estate taxes, making sure that wealth transfers generation to generation are heavily taxed to reduce income inequality, and especially among racial income inequality, is a big one. Many states do not have any estate or inheritance tax at all, and if they do, it's quite a high threshold. When it comes to the corporate side, I think the lowest of low-hanging fruit is combined reporting. It's really wonky, but just, stay with me. Essentially, large multinational corporations with many subsidiaries can house aspects of their income within subsidiaries that are headquartered in states or countries that do not tax that asset or that income. So for instance, like trademarks aren't taxed in Delaware. So every corporation will have a subsidiary that's headquartered, it's PO box or whatever, like in Delaware, so that their trademark doesn't have to get taxed. And multinational corporations can move money around wherever they want to lower their tax liability. Combined reporting forces them to look at the company and all of their subsidiaries as one unified entity, and basically apportions out uses a formula to apportion out the income and revenue that they generated in a certain state that is then subject to that corporate income tax. So it doesn't allow them to shuffle things around to their own benefit. Many states have national combined reporting, so they can't move things state to state, but quite a few states don't even enact that. Louisiana doesn't, most of the South doesn't. No state currently has worldwide combined reporting. So every corporation can still move stuff to, Curacao or wherever they want to lower their tax liability and avoid paying taxes that are owed to that state, because that is profit that is generated by the workers of that state. So We have a whole report on it, and we love working with anyone who wants to go after this because it is wonky, but once people understand it, it is incredibly popular and it makes perfect sense. Like it is quite the epitome of just pay what you owe us. Like pay what you owe us. That's it. So happy to help anyone who wants to do it. We
That's
also have
great.
revenue estimates too that can tell you how much it's going to raise in your state. So.
Great. We have some clear action steps. Watch out. You just opened that offer up to 100+ people. I think there's some other comments in the Q&A just about, digital ad tax on big tech, capital gains surcharge, wealth taxes, things that are being explored in places like Illinois. There's another really great question, just thinking about what advocates can do, and maybe on the opposite side of the policy wonk. So one of the question talks about, kind of in all of your opinions, what can and should we as advocates be doing to both quantify and humanize the risks associated with pushing so many families down in poverty and cutting their access to these life-saving programs? And, this particular individual said they're not just worried about people getting fewer resources, but also the relationship between financial instability and a risk factor for exploitation and other factors. So just thoughts on what advocates should be doing now to try to really quantify the real impact of this.
And I think there's two pieces. So I would actually, so I think the first place to start is that everybody here and every person who is part of an organization who has, who cares about this, to be really thinking about what it would mean to support advocates right now in being able to do the work that they want to do. I think that the only thing that does often scare elected officials more than taxing wealthy people is their voters saying they're not going to vote for them. So I do think that, sorry, my dog is being obnoxious, letting her out. But I think that that the work of advocacy, what I think is important for this community in particular, because we are a community built on the idea of basic income that recognizes that there's a lot of unpaid work out there. There's all kinds of components of the way our formal economy works that doesn't support the folks who are doing really important work. We need to think about how we can support our advocates right now to be at all of those, every budget hearing that's happening, every opportunity for writing an op-ed or a letter to the editor. Like, those things take time and energy, and it takes people who are already in precarity away from a shift at work or away from their kids for a little while to be able to do that work. And so I think as we do this, I think there's a lot that folks can be doing, and letter writing campaigns, showing up, connecting, even just having conversations with your neighbors and your community members or your family at a dinner table. Those can all be really important ways to just help humanize and help people understand that what's happening actually is impacting people that we know and love and care about. That kind of deep canvassing work is transformational, and actually none of this will happen, in my opinion, without it. And so I saw in here that some folks were like, where's the talking points for this? So I can really easily have that conversation. And I think those are some things to definitely we can follow up with. But I just want to make sure that from our experience, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people out there that want to advocate, want to share their stories, want to share their experiences, and there's barriers for them to be able to do that. And one of the primary barriers is money and time. And so how do we collectively give as much opportunity to those folks as possible? So I'm just going to plant that and hand it over to whoever else wants to kind of chime in around the community side of things.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to follow that. I do think that, as Stacy mentioned, there were some comments in the chat just asking about folks, first of all, like handouts. How do you talk about the impact of these cuts that are sometimes really wonky and they're in tax terms? So we'll do a bit of thinking about how we can provide some resources for people to be having these conversations in their communities with their neighbors, but also with their electeds as a follow-up to this, because it's going to be really important that we translate this to be understood, not just by people in this room, but people outside this room. There was also a great question thinking about, like, do we want a universal program where everybody gets it, or is there some value in thinking about something that's more means tested, so based on income? And so we're not going to answer that today, but we have an entire webinar dedicated to that at the beginning of September, where we'll be digging into the merits of something that everybody gets or approach that only some get, you know, maybe those who are lowest income, for example. And so we would invite you to that on September 4th. We'll also spend a little bit of time on September 18th, really thinking about not just what can states do, but what can really local government do? What can county government and what can city government do? And we'll highlight some examples of innovation that's emerging in those places that is hyper local, in spaces where you may have a lot more opportunity for creativity. And as an individual community member, have an opportunity to create a more tangible and immediate impact. So we'll be spending some time on that. And then, as Stacy mentioned, we invite you to the next meeting, which is on August 21st, and I'll drop in the chat, or we'll send in a follow-up email after this, how to join that. And that's really talking about what Stacy briefly alluded to, which is just the impact that AI disruptions may have on our workforce and what that means in terms of people's economic needs over the coming years. And then some really tangible actions that we'll be able to take in. And in September, there will be the Basic Income Week of Action. So direct action opportunities to educate electeds, opportunities and tools to have these kind of conversations. So we hope you'll consider that. And then in October, we'll really think about community power building and what that looks like. So we hope that you'll consider joining the rest of this summer series with us and really exploring what it looks like to get deeper on some of these topics that you all are bringing up in the chat. But beyond that, we're just really grateful for your time. Thank you to all of our panelists today. I definitely walked away knowing a lot more than I did before this panel. And I think the ability to articulate these really complex conversations that feel out of touch for everyday people like me into something that's tangible and understandable will hopefully help us be agents of change and understand what we can do in response to this moment. So thank you to all. Thank you to Give Directly and the ITEP team who co-hosted on this. And we will send a follow-up email with some of the resources that we were dropping in the chats with these slides and with other opportunities to engage. And feel free to reach out to all of us if you have questions, thoughts, ideas. Neva in particular has offered to solve all the tax problems in every state, so definitely reach out to her. And beyond that, we're really grateful for you joining us all, and thank you. Thanks for being with us. I know this was a long meeting on a busy week, so we appreciate your time and look forward to this being the first of many conversations.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.